So the US White House has confirmed that US President Joe Biden will not be traveling to Australia for the Quad Summit. He will be going to Hiroshima in Japan for the G7 Summit later this week. But he's curtailing his Asia-Pacific trip midway through because he has to rush back to Washington to negotiate the debt ceiling with the Republicans and with the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Now, this is an extraordinary turn of events because it is the United States which is the driver of the Quad group of countries, or the quadrilateral group of countries, which includes India, the United States, Japan, and of course Australia. The Quad essentially came into full frontal action when Joe Biden had the first summit-level meeting in 2020 after he became the president in 2021. The first summit-level meeting of the Quad took place. Even though Quad as an idea had been floating around for a number of years, it was the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe who came up with the idea of the quadrilateral grouping of countries. Initially, countries like India and Australia were not particularly warming up to the idea, but as they had to contend with and deal with an increasingly aggressive and assertive China, these countries came on board. But even when the former US President Donald Trump was in office, there were meetings of Quad representatives, not at the highest level, not at the head of state or head of government level, but at the ministerial level. It was only after Biden assumed office that he escalated this or elevated this to the highest level, and they've had multiple meetings of the quadrilateral grouping of countries. Now, the very reason why the Quad came into existence was to use the collective power of these democracies, the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, to collectively take on the might of China. So Joe Biden, curtailing his visit, not going to Sydney for the Quad Summit, sends out the signal to Beijing that he's got more important things, he's got more pressing things. Now, if you were sitting in Beijing, if you were a member of Xi Jinping's cabinet, or if you were Xi Jinping himself, you're looking at this and saying that what sort of grouping of countries is this? If the United States is not serious about this grouping of 4 countries to take on China, these 4 democratic countries to take on China, then why would the rest of the world take this grouping or United States leadership seriously? As far as the debt ceiling is concerned, like I said, this is an embarrassing situation for any president, including this current Democratic president, that he has to give up on a major strategic alliance, something that the United States came up with and the United States has been a driver of, give that up halfway through and head back to address domestic concerns. Now, having said that, all US presidents have had to deal with domestic crises from time to time, including raising the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling currently is about $31 trillion, and that's primarily because the United States government spends far more than what its income is. Its revenues are far less than what it spends either through domestic spending, welfare measures like Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security. There's also spending on the military budget, so on and so forth. So its spending far outweighs its revenues, as a result of which every time they have to raise the debt ceiling, they have to go back to the US Congress and get permission from the US Congress to raise the debt ceiling. Over the last 40, 50 years, the debt ceiling has been raised a number of times, more than 70 times at last count. Essentially, the United States has a ballooning deficit which it's not able to meet with its revenues. So yes, this embarrassing domestic situation is what has forced the US president to curtail his Asia visit and go back, but it's going to have very, very important strategic implications. The Chinese are going to look at this and say that the Quad is not a serious arrangement, that when push came to shove, the US president actually dumped the Quad and had to rush back for pressing domestic concerns. Also, the signal this will send, not just to members of the Quad, including countries like India, Australia, maybe even Japan, that the United States may not necessarily be a reliable partner to funnel through this idea of the quadrilateral grouping of countries. Also, the message that it sends out to ASEAN countries. Remember, many of them have their own problems with China, have their own territorial disputes with China, whether it's the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia. All of these countries are stuck in territorial and maritime disputes with China. They were looking to the Quad to be some kind of a directional force on how to take on China. Clearly, no one country on its own can take on China because of its economic and military heft. So the only way they could take on China, or hope to take on China, it was as a grouping of countries. If this grouping of countries, the Quad, is not able to send out that unified message, if the most important member of Quad, the President of the United States, has to rush back because of domestic concerns, that sends out a note of dissonance, that sends out a note of discordance as far as Quad itself is concerned. So this is something that is not just embarrassing to the members of Quad, certainly it's embarrassing to the United States presidency, to Joe Biden, to the White House, and also for US allies and partners in the Asia Pacific.